Coralee Voorhees, at 69, after 35 years teaching piano performance at the Tuxedo Park Conservatory, and a lifetime of believing that her quiet piano tuner father had loved both his children equally, had stood in the conference room of her brother Roland's Manhattan firm one Tuesday morning in October and watched him push a single-dollar bill across the polished oak table. "Your share, Cora. Dad had nothing. You can sign the release here." Her dark brown eyes had not lifted from the bill for a long second. She had not spoken. She had taken the dollar. She had walked out, a folded crisp dollar bill in her left pocket and a single envelope from her father's elder care attorney in her right. That was what Coralee Voorhees had to her name when she stepped onto the curb outside Roland's tower. The envelope said only, "From Linus, for Cora. Open with your lawyer." But what Roland Voorhees, with 35 years on Wall Street and a legal team that billed itself by the quarter hour, had never understood about his quiet piano tuner father was that Linus had spent 50 years tuning the Steinways of Tuxedo Park's oldest families and had quietly become the trusted caretaker of one Marguerite Wexler, a woman who had left him a sealed envelope of her own. Behind a Gothic-arched front door, at the top of a winding mountain drive, the truth of what Linus had inherited was waiting for the daughter he had loved most. If you've ever been handed a single-dollar bill by your own brother and told that was the entirety of your inheritance, if you've ever sat in the polished glass of a Manhattan tower and felt your father's life reduced to a folded piece of paper, if you've ever stood on a sidewalk wondering whether your own family knew you at all, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because what Coralee Voorhees found at the top of that long, winding gravel drive in Tuxedo Park, behind a Gothic-arched door her father had been keeping the key to for 14 years, will make you believe that piano tuners hear what bankers never bother to listen for. Welcome to the last chapter. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Roland Voorhees' Manhattan firm had a long oak table polished to the color of dark honey and a wall of glass that looked south toward the harbor. Coralee had arrived at 9 in the morning, carrying her worn medium brown leather suitcase with brass clasps, because she had taken the early train down from Tuxedo Park and intended to take the noon train back. She wore her long midnight blue wool coat with silver buttons over a cream silk blouse with a small cameo brooch at the throat, dove gray wide-leg trousers, low black leather pointed-toe shoes. Her pale silver hair was wound into the low, loose chignon she had worn for 40 years, held with the antique tortoiseshell hairpins her mother had given her at 16. The gold-rim half-moon glasses on a fine gold chain rested against the cameo. She had come because Roland had written her a letter on firm stationery, saying that the estate of their father, Linus Voorhees, had been settled and that her presence was required for the disbursement. Roland sat at the head of the table in a navy three-piece bespoke suit with a maroon silk tie and gold cufflinks. His balding silver-gray hair caught the cold morning light. Two of his junior lawyers sat to his right with leather portfolios open and pens uncapped. A third lawyer, a woman in a black suit, sat to his left and slid a thin folder across the polished wood toward Cora. The folder contained one page. The page contained one paragraph. The paragraph stated that Linus Voorhees, deceased the previous October at the age of 92, had died possessed of personal effects valued at approximately $1, and that his surviving daughter, Coralee Voorhees, was entitled to her one-half share, namely 50 cents, which had been rounded up to a single dollar in the interest of administrative simplicity. Roland reached into his inside jacket pocket and withdrew a folded dollar bill, crisp and new, as though he had stopped at the bank that morning specifically to obtain it. He pressed it flat against the oak with 2 fingers and slid it across the table toward his sister. "Your share, Cora. Dad had nothing. You can sign the release here." His voice was level, almost gentle, the voice he used with widows in his investment seminars. The female lawyer offered Cora a fountain pen. Cora's dark brown eyes did not lift from the bill for a long, long second. She thought in that second of her father at the kitchen table in the small house on Fox Hill Road, polishing his tuning hammers with a chamois cloth at 90 years old. She thought of the cup of weak tea he had drunk every morning for 60 years from the same chipped porcelain cup. She thought of his hands, which had been the most careful hands she had ever seen on any human being, and which had taught her, when she was 7, how to listen to a single note until it stopped trembling. She did not speak. She picked up the dollar bill with 2 fingers. She folded it once. She slipped it into the left pocket of her wool coat. She did not sign the release. She stood up. She picked up her suitcase. She walked the length of the conference room toward the glass door. Roland said, behind her, "Cora, sign the release." She did not turn around. The female lawyer half rose from her chair. Roland gestured her back down. Cora walked past the receptionist's desk and pressed the elevator button and waited for the chime, and her face in the polished steel of the elevator door was the face of a woman who had decided something very quietly and would not be moved. In the lobby, the doorman tipped his cap and held the revolving door for her. On the curb, she lifted her hand for a taxi. The driver took her to Penn Station. She bought a one-way ticket to Tuxedo Park on the 11:40 train. She sat in the window seat of a half-empty car and watched the Hudson River slide past on her left, the autumn gold trees blazing on the cliffs, and she did not weep. She slid her hand into her right pocket and felt the second envelope there, the one her father's elder care attorney had sent to her 2 weeks earlier, with a small note instructing her not to open it without him. The envelope was thick, and her father's handwriting was on the front in faded blue ink. "For Cora, open with Anders." The train climbed slowly through Harriman and along the Ramapo and into the gated community of Tuxedo Park as the afternoon began to thin into early dusk. The stone gate posts of the park stood at the foot of the hill in the way they had stood since 1885, and the long winding gravel drives wound up between the oaks, and the fog was already gathering off Tuxedo Lake. Cora got off at the small station and walked the half-mile to her cottage on Fox Hill Road. She had lived in the cottage for 43 years, since the year she had married Frederick. She let herself in. She put her suitcase in the hallway. She put the kettle on for tea. She set the folded dollar bill on the kitchen table next to the unopened envelope. She sat down across from them. She looked at them for a long time. At 7 that evening, she lifted the receiver of the old rotary phone in the hallway and dialed the number of Anders Halverson, her father's lawyer for the past 3 years, and a quiet old friend of Linus's from before she was born. Anders answered on the second ring, his voice low and unhurried as it always was, and Cora said, "Anders, I need to read whatever Dad left me before I sign anything Roland's office sends." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that is full rather than empty. And then Anders said, "Cora, come to my office tomorrow at 10. Bring the envelope. Bring the suitcase. Do not sign anything Roland sends. Do not speak to anyone in his firm. I have been waiting for this call for 14 months." She set the receiver down. She drank her tea. She sat at the kitchen table for another hour with the dollar bill in the envelope, and at last, with the kettle cold and the fog pressing white against the windows, she lifted the flap of the envelope. Inside, there was a single sheet of cream paper folded once, and inside the folded paper, there was a small brass key on a tarnished silver chain. The handwriting on the paper was her father's careful pianist's hand, the hand that had taught her to write a clean treble clef at 6. "My Cora, if Roland has shown you the dollar, then the time has come. Anders has a rest. Trust him. Dad." She read the note 3 times. She lifted the brass key off the table and held it up to the lamplight. The key was old, perhaps 100 years, with a hollow shaft and an elaborate bow shaped like a small 4-leaf clover. She did not know what door it opened. She closed her hand around it. She wept then, quietly, for the first time since she had walked out of the conference room, and she wept not for the dollar, but for the love in the 4 sentences her father had written, which was the same love that had been folded around her since the day she was born. The next morning, before she could drive to Anders's office, the small piano studio she had been renting downtown in the village of Tuxedo Park called her at 8:15. The voice on the line was the studio's owner, a kind man named Henrik, who had rented her the back room with the Steinway upright for the past 4 years, so that she could keep teaching a few private students after she had retired from the conservatory. Henrik's voice was apologetic and unsteady. "Cora, I am so sorry. There is a woman here. She says she is your sister-in-law. She has a letter from a lawyer. She says the studio's lease was paid by your father, and that the lease is now part of his estate, and that you have 60 days to vacate." Cora closed her eyes. She knew the woman without asking. Petra Voorhees, Roland's wife, 64, who had never once in 40 years sat across a Christmas table from Cora without finding a small way to remind her that the Voorhees family fortune ran through Roland's side of the marriage and not through hers. Cora drove down to the studio. Petra was standing in the front room with her arms folded over a camel coat, holding a cease and desist letter on cream legal paper. The letter bore the seal of Roland's firm. It claimed that Linus had paid the studio's annual lease in advance for the past 4 years out of a small fund that has now been fully accounted to the estate. The letter was a careful piece of intimidation. The lease itself was Cora's lease, in Cora's name, paid out of Cora's own pension, and Linus had never paid $1 of it. Henrik knew that. Petra knew that. The letter knew that. None of it mattered, because the letter was on Roland's stationery, and Henrik was a frightened man who did not have a lawyer of his own, and 60 days was enough time for him to feel he had done the decent thing without being sued. He stood in the doorway of the back room and could not meet Cora's eyes. Cora did not argue. She nodded to Henrik. She thanked him for 4 good years. She told him she would have the studio cleared by the end of the month. Petra stood at the door and watched her, and as Cora walked past her with her music bag, Petra said, in the voice of a woman handing out alms, "I'm sorry it has come to this, dear. Roland did try to find something for you." Cora paused at the threshold. She looked at Petra over the rim of her gold half-moon glasses. She said very quietly, "Thank you, Petra. Drive safely back to the city." Petra blinked. She had expected something else. Cora walked out into the autumn light and did not look back. That night, at midnight, Cora let herself into the studio with the key Henrik had not yet asked her to return. The village was dark. The lake was a sheet of black glass below the window. She switched on the small lamp over the keyboard of the rented Steinway upright. She sat down on the worn wooden bench. She opened the cover. She placed her hands above the keys. She played the Schubert intermezzo in a flat that her father had taught her at 14, the one he had said was the saddest beautiful thing Schubert ever wrote. And as the chords moved through her fingers, she let herself weep at last for everything she had not yet wept for. She wept for Frederick, who had died 7 years ago of a stroke at the breakfast table on a Sunday morning, in a way she would never describe, even to herself. She wept for her father, who had died 1 year ago of natural causes at 92 in his own bed in the cottage on Fox Hill Road, with her hand in his hand and his eyes turned toward the window. She wept for the 35 years she had spent teaching at the conservatory, raising students who now played in orchestras across 3 continents. She wept for the way her brother had spent a lifetime calling their father's piano tuning Dad's hobby. She wept for the dollar bill on her kitchen table. She played until her hands hurt. She closed the cover. She locked the door behind her. She drove home through the fog. In the morning, she drove to the small office of Anders Halvorsen at the edge of the village. Anders met her at the door, 71 years old, tall and lean in a charcoal cardigan and corduroy trousers, his white hair cut short, his eyes mild behind round wire-rimmed glasses. He took her coat. He poured her a cup of tea. He led her into the back office, where a thick file lay closed on the broad walnut desk. He sat down across from her. He folded his hands. He said, "Cora, sit down. There's a great deal you need to read." The file Anders Halvorsen opened on the walnut desk that morning had 3 sections, separated by stiff cardstock dividers in 3 colors, and he opened them one at a time, as a man opens a series of doors in a house he has been waiting to show. The first section contained Linus Voorhees' last will and testament, dated and witnessed 3 months before his death, signed in his careful pianist's hand, and notarized by a county clerk in Goshen. The will named Coralee Voorhees as sole heir of all property, real and personal, that Linus possessed at the time of his passing, and explicitly disinherited his son, Roland Voorhees, on the grounds that Roland had been amply provided for by his own choices in life. Cora read the document twice. She placed her hand on the page where her father's signature lay. Anders watched her without speaking. The second section contained a sealed bequest letter on heavy cream paper, addressed in a fine, slanted feminine hand, to Linus Voorhees, dear friend, to be opened upon my death. Anders said, "This is from Marguerite Wexler. I have held it in escrow in this office since 2010. She came to me one afternoon with this letter and a notarized copy of her own will, and she said that I was to release both to Linus upon her death. Marguerite died 14 months ago, 3 months before your father, and I released the letter to Linus by hand the day after her funeral. Linus read it sitting in this very chair. He wept. He thanked me. He asked me to hold the original here in the office until a year after his own death, because he said the truth of what was inside it would be too much for him to carry alone in the world, and because he wanted to be the one to tell you, but he was no longer sure he would live long enough to do so." Anders paused. "He did not, and so the responsibility has fallen to me." He turned the letter so that Cora could read it. Marguerite Wexler, in her fine slanted hand, written 2 years before her own death, had named Linus Voorhees as the sole heir of her 1893 Victorian Gothic mansion on Tower Hill Road in Tuxedo Park, together with all its contents, in gratitude for 30 years of his quiet care. She had no living descendants. She had outlived 2 husbands and a single daughter who had died in childhood. She had named Linus, she wrote, because in 30 years of weekly visits, he had been the only person who had treated her not as a wealthy widow, but as a friend, and because she had heard him speak of his daughter Coralee with the love that had sustained him in his loneliness, and she wished that daughter to inherit the house after him. The letter was witnessed by 2 of Marguerite's neighbors and notarized. The 3rd section of the file contained a hand-drawn map of Tuxedo Park in Linus's own hand, with one mansion circled in soft pencil and labeled in his neat capitals, Wexler, Tower Hill Road. Beside the map lay a small ink sketch of a brass key with an elaborate 4-leaf clover bow. Cora reached up and unhooked the tarnished silver chain from around her neck. She set the brass key beside the sketch. The key in her palm and the key on the page were the same. Her hand trembled. Anders said, "That is the key to the front door of the Wexler mansion. Your father has been carrying it on that chain for 14 months. He gave it to me 3 days before he died and asked me to put it into the envelope you opened last night." The mansion on Tower Hill Road had been sealed for 14 months. Anders had instructed the Tuxedo Park trustees to hold the property in caretaker status during the mandatory probate period that followed Linus's death, and the trustees, who had known Marguerite all their lives and had never trusted Roland a single day of his, had agreed without argument. White linen sheets had been drawn over every piece of furniture. The leaded windows had been covered from inside. The wraparound veranda had been swept once a month by a groundsman paid out of an escrow account Anders managed. The slate-roofed towers stood quiet above the autumn gold forest, and the morning fog rose from Tuxedo Lake below them every dawn, and no one had crossed the threshold of the Gothic-arched oak door for 423 days. Anders said, "Cora, we will go there tomorrow morning. Wendell Ashford will meet us at the gate. He has known Marguerite for 40 years and your father for 30. Imogen Tenzer of Sotheby's will arrive an hour after we do. She has authenticated instruments for the Tuxedo Park families for 2 decades, and there are things in that house that may need to be authenticated." Cora set the brass key down on the cream letter. She closed her eyes. She said, "Anders, did Roland know any of this?" Anders looked at her for a long moment over his round wire-rimmed glasses. He said, "No, your father took great care that he would not. We will speak more about why tomorrow. Go home now. Sleep if you can. Wear walking shoes." She slept. She slept better than she had slept in 14 months. In the morning she rose at 6 and dressed carefully in the way her father had taught her to dress for important occasions, which was the way she dressed every day. Long midnight blue wool coat with silver buttons, cream silk blouse with the cameo brooch, dove gray trousers, low black leather pointed toe shoes, pale silver hair in the low loose chignon, the gold rim half-moon glasses on the fine gold chain. She placed the brass key around her neck under the cameo. She picked up her worn medium brown leather suitcase with brass clasps. She drove down the hill to Anders's office. Anders met her in his old gray Volvo. They drove through the village in the morning fog and up the winding gravel drives of Tuxedo Park, past the stone gateposts of side roads she had not driven in 20 years, past the high carriage houses of families whose children she had taught at the conservatory, past the long, low stone walls and the autumn gold oaks. Tower Hill Road climbed away from the lake along the spine of a high ridge. The drive narrowed. The trees closed overhead. After a mile and a half, the gravel widened into a broad turnaround, and there, set back from the road behind an old wrought iron gate with a lion's head crest, stood the Wexler mansion. It was 3.5 stories of stone and shingle facade with a gabled slate roof and 3 towers, 1 round, 2 square, and tall mullioned leaded windows now covered with white linen sheets from inside. Ivy and wisteria climbed the walls. The wraparound veranda with its carved balustrade ran around 3 sides. A heavy oak Gothic-arched front door with iron strap hinges stood under a stone porte-cochere. Cora stepped out of the Volvo and stood at the gate and looked up at the house. Her hand went to the brass key at her throat. Anders said, very softly, "Your father drove up this drive twice a week for 30 years. Wendell Ashford was waiting at the gate, 68 years old, retired director of the Tuxedo Park Historical Society, in a brown tweed jacket and a wool scarf the color of old burgundy. He was the one who had first put Anders in touch with Marguerite's care arrangements years ago, and he had been Linus's friend for 3 decades. He took Cora's hand in both of his. He said, 'Coralee, I have waited a long time to walk you up this drive. Your father spoke of you constantly. Marguerite came to know you through him.' Cora could not speak. Wendell unlocked the wrought iron gate with his own caretaker key and pushed it slowly inward. The hinges sang in the cold air. They walked up the gravel together. Anders carried his thick file. Wendell carried a leather folder of historical records he had brought from the Society archive. Cora carried her brown suitcase. Halfway up the drive, Wendell began, in his quiet historian's voice, to tell Cora about Marguerite Wexler's last decade. Marguerite had been the only child of the Wexler shipping family, and she had outlived her parents and her 2 husbands and her single daughter, and had ended her life as the last of her line in a house she had been born in. She had been a fine amateur pianist herself. She had collected fine American art carefully and quietly all her life. In her last decade, she had become reclusive. She had refused the company of the social set, who had only remembered her existence when her name appeared in the trust deeds of the park. The only person she had wanted in her music room had been Linus Voorhees, who came every Tuesday and Friday afternoon to tune the 1898 Steinway Concert Grand and to drink a cup of weak tea with her at the small mahogany table by the window. He never charged her $1 after the first 10 years, Wendell said. She paid him anyway, of course. She paid him in books, in small frame prints, in cuttings from her wisteria. He took everything she gave him because he understood that she needed to give. The friendship between them was, in my 40 years in this park, the most quietly remarkable I ever witnessed. Cora's pianist discipline took over as they reached the porte-cochere. Anders had told her there were things in this house that might need to be authenticated, and a lifetime of musical training had taught her that careful examination, methodical notation, and patient attention were the way one moved through anything one had never seen before. She set the suitcase down on the flagstones. She drew a small leather notebook and a silver pencil from her coat pocket. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. She wrote, Wexler Mansion, Tower Hill Road. She wrote, arrived 9:14 a.m., October 27th. She wrote, gate opened by Wendell Ashford with caretaker key. She wrote, front door not yet opened. She walked the length of the veranda first. She noted the carved balustrade, the white painted porch ceiling, the 2 long wicker rockers covered in dust sheets, the small mahogany side table beside the front door with a cracked white china cashpo still holding the dry stems of last autumn's chrysanthemums. She wrote, China Cashpo, cracked, possibly Sèvres, late 19th century, requires verification. She bent and looked at the iron strap hinges of the front door. She noted that the hinges had been recently oiled. Wendell, watching her, said, I oiled them last month. Your father oiled them once a year for 30 years. I have continued the practice. She wrote, Hinges oiled last month by Ashford. She walked around to the south side of the veranda and looked at the wisteria climbing the stone and shingle wall. The vines were old, perhaps 100 years, their trunks as thick as her wrist. She noted the variety. She noted the small jasmine bush at the foot of the south porch step, dormant now in the late October cold, but unmistakable to a woman whose mother had grown jasmine on the Fox Hill Road cottage porch for 50 years. She wrote, Jasmine, south porch step, suspected Wexler's own. She thought of her father, who had loved the smell of jasmine more than any other flower, and she understood, standing there on the south veranda, why he had spent 30 years walking up to this door. She walked back to the front of the house. Anders was watching her with the small, quiet pride of a man who had told her, in his office the day before, that her father had named her sole heir because she was, in his words, the child who had inherited his ear. Cora took a slow breath. She lifted the brass key from her throat. She turned it once in her palm to feel the weight of it. She placed her left hand on the iron strap above the keyhole. She fitted the key into the lock with her right hand. That was when the gravel hissed behind them on the drive. A black Lincoln town car, with tinted windows, rolled up to the wrought iron gate, paused, and continued through, gravel popping under its tires. It came to a halt 100 feet behind the Volvo. The driver's door opened. Roland Voorhees stepped out in his navy three-piece bespoke suit and his polished black wingtip Oxfords, his black leather attaché in his left hand, his face the color of a man who had been driving a long time on very little sleep. The passenger door opened. Petra Voorhees stepped out in her camel coat with her phone already pressed to her ear. Cora's hand stilled on the brass key. Anders set his file on the porch railing. Wendell stepped down off the veranda and walked to the top of the stone steps and stopped there. Anders put a hand, very gently, on Cora's shoulder. He said, Wait one moment, Cora. Do not turn the key yet. Let Wendell handle this. Cora's fingers closed around the brass shaft. She did not turn the key. She did not turn around. Her dark brown eyes looked through the iron strap of the door at the grain of the oak, and she breathed slowly, the way her father had taught her to breathe before she walked onto a recital stage at 15. Wendell Ashford stood at the top of the stone steps in his brown tweed jacket and his burgundy scarf, his hands clasped behind his back, his white hair lifting slightly in the cold morning air. Roland walked across the gravel toward the porte cochere with the hard, quick stride of a man who had spent 35 years intimidating opposing counsel. He was 10 paces away when Wendell spoke. Wendell did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He had not raised his voice in 40 years in this park. Roland, that is far enough. You will stop where you are. Roland stopped. He had not expected the voice. He had expected to find his sister alone with a country lawyer and a sentimental old historian, and he had expected to walk up to the door as the elder son of the family and put his hand on the brass key himself. He looked up at Wendell. He produced a thin, polished smile. Wendell, good morning. I have come to take possession of my late father's effects. There has been a small misunderstanding about the chain of inheritance, which my counsel will be happy to clarify. I would ask you to step aside. Wendell did not step aside. He looked at Roland with the mildness of a man who had buried more friends than he had living, and he said, "Roland, I have been a member of this park for 40 years. Your sister has full legal standing here, and you have none. The estate of Marguerite Wexler was settled 14 months ago in escrow under the supervision of Mr. Halverson, whom you know perfectly well, and the property you are standing on is no longer in question. You will leave the property until Mr. Halverson invites you back, which he will not do today." Roland's polished smile thinned. He turned his head and looked at Anders on the veranda. "Anders, we have known each other for 30 years. I am asking, as a professional courtesy, that you allow me to be present for the opening of the door. There may be documents inside that pertain to my father's estate. I have a fiduciary interest in their preservation." Anders did not move from the railing. He said, "Roland, the fiduciary interest in this property lies entirely with your sister. The probate has been concluded. The mandatory year-and-a-day waiting period has elapsed. I have filed nothing publicly because I was waiting for Cora to be ready to walk up this drive, which she now is. You will leave." Petra came forward across the gravel with her phone in her hand. "I have the firm on the line. Roland, tell them we are being denied access to a property that was paid for by the estate." She held the phone toward Roland. Wendell looked at her for the first time. His mild eyes did not change, but something in the set of his mouth made Petra falter half a step. He said, "Mrs. Voorhees, I would suggest you tell whomever you have on the line that the Tuxedo Park trustees were notified in writing of the Wexler bequest in 2010 and have held it in confidence at Mr. Halverson's request ever since. The trustees will testify under oath that they have known of your sister-in-law's interest in this house since the year she was 45. Whatever instruction your firm wishes to issue this morning will be a matter of public record by lunchtime. I would consider that very carefully before speaking another word into that telephone." Petra lowered the phone. Roland's hands had begun to shake very slightly, the way the hands of a man shake when he has discovered that a door he expected to open has been bolted from the inside for 14 years. He took 2 steps backward. He raised his voice for the first time. "Cora, turn around. Cora, look at me." Cora did not turn around. Her hand on the brass key did not move. She heard her brother's voice rise over the gravel and over the cold morning fog, and over the iron strap of the Gothic-arched oak door, and she thought of the dollar bill on her kitchen table on Fox Hill Road, and she thought of her father's hand polishing his tuning hammers at 90 years old, and she did not turn around. She had decided something, on the curb outside Roland's tower in Manhattan, that she would not unmake on the porch of a mansion her father had been keeping for her since the year she was born. Roland stood on the gravel for another long minute. Wendell did not move. Anders did not move. Petra made 2 more phone calls in a low, sharp voice that nobody on the porch listened to. At last, Roland turned. He walked back to the Lincoln. Petra followed him. The doors closed. The engine started. The car backed slowly down the drive. The wrought iron gate swallowed it. The hiss of the gravel faded into the cold air. Wendell did not move from the porch. Cora turned the brass key in the lock. The mechanism was old. It resisted for a quarter turn. Then, very smoothly, it gave. The bolt slid. The door swung inward into a high-ceilinged Gothic foyer, and a smell came out to meet her of cold air and beeswax and old wood and, faintly, of jasmine. She stepped across the threshold. Anders followed her. Wendell came last and closed the door behind them. The foyer was tall and narrow, with a carved oak staircase rising against the left wall and a stained glass window above the first landing in the colors of irises and violets. White linen sheets were draped over a long, carved console table, and over what appeared to be a tall hall-stand mirror beside it. The floor was a herringbone parquet of dark walnut. A small brass chandelier hung from a ceiling rose, carved into a wreath of acanthus leaves. Cora stood for a long moment in the cold light from the stained glass and let herself simply look. Wendell led her through the archway into the front parlor. White linen sheets covered every chair and every settee, and every small round occasional table. On the walls hung frame pieces of fine American art. A chilled Hassam landscape of the Ramapos in late autumn. Another Childa Hassam landscape of Tuxedo Lake at dawn. 2 small Whistler etchings, and a single John Singer Sargent portrait, 4 feet tall, of a young dark-haired woman in a high-collared white blouse with a single string of pearls. The young woman's eyes were the eyes of Marguerite Wexler at 26. Cora stopped in front of the portrait. Wendell said, in his quiet historian's voice, "Sargent painted her in London in the spring of 1881. She brought it home that summer. It has hung in this parlor for 145 years. They walked through the wide pocket doors into the music room. The music room was the largest room in the house, 28 feet long, with a coffered oak ceiling and a tall fieldstone fireplace at one end. The 4 mullioned windows along the south wall were covered with white linen from inside, but the morning light came through the linen as a soft milky gold. At the center of the room, alone on the carpeted floor, uncovered, polished to a deep ebony shine, stood the 1898 Steinway Concert Grand. The lid was propped open, the keyboard was uncovered, a single brass music lamp arched over the rack. The bench, upholstered in faded green velvet, sat squared to the keyboard as though someone had risen from it 5 minutes earlier. Cora's breath caught. She walked slowly across the room. She placed her right hand, very lightly, on the lid above the bass strings. She closed her eyes. She could feel through the wood, the small low hum of the iron frame settling in the cold. Wendell said behind her, "Your father tuned this instrument every Tuesday for 30 years. He was here a week before he died." She did not open her eyes. She nodded once. Imogen Tenzer arrived at 10:15. She was 38 years old, in a plain gray wool coat and sensible black boots, her hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under her arm. She had driven up from Manhattan that morning at Anders's invitation, and her firm had handled Tuxedo Park instruments for 30 years. Wendell let her in at the front door. She came into the music room and stopped 6 feet from the Steinway, the way a doctor stops 6 feet from a patient before approaching. And she said, very softly, 1898, Hamburg Action, 3rd Concert Grand of that year's production. I have been hoping someone would let me into this room since 2002. Cora opened her eyes. She liked Imogen at once. Anders led them then to a small library off the music room, a room he had not yet entered himself, and that Wendell had only seen twice in 40 years. The library was 12 feet square, with floor-to-ceiling oak shelves on 3 walls, and a small leaded window on the 4th. A flat-topped mahogany cabinet stood in the center of the room with shallow drawers. Anders unlocked the cabinet with a small key from Marguerite's bequest letter. He drew out the top drawer. In the drawer, on cream archival paper inside acid-free folders, lay original autograph manuscripts, handwritten in ink, on staff paper that had been ruled and aged for over 2 centuries, of 2 Beethoven piano sonatas and 3 Chopin nocturnes. The Beethoven manuscripts had been purchased by Marguerite's father in 1913 from a London dealer named Benton and Hawes, and the original bills of sale lay in a small folio at the back of the drawer. The Chopin nocturnes had come into the Wexler collection in 1922 from a Parisian estate. Imogen Tenzer set her portfolio down on the cabinet. She drew on a pair of white cotton gloves. She bent over the first folder. She opened it. She did not breathe for a long moment. She said very quietly, "Mrs. Voorhees, I am looking at the autograph manuscript of Beethoven's Opus 109 in his own hand, with the markings I was trained at the Beethoven House in Bonn to recognize. The provenance is intact. The bill of sale is from a dealer whose records were destroyed in 1940, but whose stamp I have personally verified in 3 other authenticated sales. This is not a copy. This is not a school manuscript. This is the composer's hand." She closed the folder. She opened the second. She closed it. She opened a third. She closed it. She turned to Anders. "I will have to bring my colleague Mr. Ashton up from the city next week to confirm, but I am willing to stake my professional reputation now on this much. The 2 Beethoven manuscripts and the 3 Chopin nocturnes in this drawer have, conservatively, an auction value of $4.6 million, possibly higher. The Beethoven Opus 109 alone is one of perhaps 3 autograph manuscripts of that sonata known to exist." Cora sat down very slowly on the small library chair behind her. She placed both hands on her knees. She did not weep. She looked at the cabinet for a long minute, and then she looked at Anders, and she said, "My father knew this was here." Anders said, "Yes. Marguerite told him in 2008. He came home and could not eat for 2 days. He told me. He told no one else." Wendell stepped to the bookshelves and ran his finger along a row of bound volumes on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. He said, "Cora, there is one more thing I think we should look for. Your father told me once, in passing, that Marguerite kept her most private papers in the music room behind a panel he had helped her install in 1995. I have never seen the panel myself. He was the only man she trusted to install it. He drew it for me on the back of a tuning slip once, but I could not now find the slip." He smiled a small, dry historian's smile. "Perhaps your eye will see what mine cannot." They went back into the music room. Cora walked slowly along the south wall, her fingers trailing the wainscoting. Halfway down the wall, between the 2nd and 3rd windows, she paused. The wainscoting had a small irregularity, a half-inch step where the molding above did not quite line up with the molding below. She bent. She pressed her palm flat against the wood. The panel gave half an inch and then released. She drew it open. Behind it, set into the lath, was a small fireproof safe, 12 inches square, with a brass dial. The combination was written in Marguerite's bequest letter. Anders read it aloud. Cora turned the dial. The safe opened. Inside the safe lay 2 sealed envelopes. The first was on the same heavy cream paper as the bequest letter. It was addressed in Marguerite's fine, slanted hand to Linus Voorhees, my dear friend, to be opened by your daughter Coralee, in the presence of Anders Halvorsen. Cora drew it out. She broke the seal. She unfolded the page. Marguerite Wexler had written, 6 months before her death, a letter naming Linus as sole heir of the mansion and contents in gratitude for 30 years of his quiet care, and explicitly noting that Linus's daughter Coralee, of whom he speaks with the love that has sustained him in his loneliness, is the only person I would ever wish to live in this house after me. Beneath the letter, clipped to the back of it, was a notarized codicil to Linus's own will, dated 6 months before his death, leaving all that comes to me from Marguerite Wexler and all that I have accumulated in service to her family, to Cora. The second envelope was thicker. Cora drew it out. She opened it. Inside was a binder. Inside the binder were photocopies of documents that Anders, over Cora's shoulder, recognized at once. He drew in a slow breath. He said, "Oh, Cora. Oh, Linus." He kept it. The binder documented that Roland Voorhees had attempted to file a forged will in the Orange County Surrogate's Court 3 months before Linus's death. The forged will named Roland sole heir of all Linus's property, real and personal. It bore a forgery of Linus's signature and the notarization stamp of a probate clerk Roland had cultivated for years in Goshen. The forgery had never made it past Anders's desk because Anders had been holding Linus's true will in escrow and had recognized at once that the signature on the forged document did not match the signatures on the 7 other documents he held for Linus. Anders had quietly contacted the New York State Bar Association and the Orange County District Attorney's Office to have the forged will pulled and the probate clerk investigated, and he had brought the binder home to Linus, who had wept at the kitchen table on Fox Hill Road, and asked Anders to keep a copy in the Wexler safe as the final piece of insurance against his son. Behind the binder was a list, in Linus's handwriting on a single sheet of yellow legal paper, of 7 other elderly clients of Roland's firm, whose estates Roland had attempted to siphon over the past decade through similar maneuvers. Clients whose names Linus had gathered, slowly and carefully, from the wives and the housekeepers and the piano tuners of Tuxedo Park over 30 years of weekly visits. Cora read the list. She recognized 4 of the names. 2 of them had been her father's clients. 1 of them had been her piano teacher's mother. Slipped between the pages of the codicil, on a separate folded sheet of cream paper in her father's careful pianist's hand, was 1 more letter. Cora drew it out. She unfolded it. She read it aloud, because Anders and Wendell and Imogen were standing around her in the music room, and the morning fog was lifting from Tuxedo Lake outside the south windows, and there was no longer any reason to read it alone. My Cora, if you are reading this, your brother has done what we both feared he would do, and Anders has brought you up the hill. Marguerite was my friend for 40 years, and she loved you because I loved you. The Steinway is yours. The Sargent is yours. The Beethoven manuscripts are yours. The truth about your brother is yours. Sit at the keyboard of the Steinway and play me 1 Schubert intermezzo, my girl. Then walk out into the morning fog with your suitcase and write the rest of your life. Dad. Cora's voice did not break until the last sentence. Wendell wept then, very quietly, his hands folded behind his back, his white head bowed. Imogen Tenzer turned away to the window and pressed her gloved fingers to the corners of her eyes. Anders stood with his hand on the back of the small library chair and did not move. Cora folded the letter once. She placed it in the inside breast pocket of her wool coat over her heart. She walked across the music room to the Steinway. She drew out the green velvet bench. She sat down. She placed her hands above the keys. Imogen said, behind her, Mrs. Voorhees, the Beethoven manuscripts alone will fund a foundation. I have not seen this kind of provenance in 22 years of authentication. Anders said, Cora, your brother is in very serious trouble. We will be calling the New York State Bar before noon. Wendell did not speak. Cora nodded once without turning. She lowered her hands to the keys. She played the Schubert intermezzo in a flat, the saddest beautiful thing Schubert ever wrote, and the chords moved through her fingers and through the iron frame her father had tuned a week before he died and out into the high coffered ceiling of the music room. And Marguerite Wexler's young dark-eyed sergeant face looked across at her from the parlor wall, and the morning fog outside the south windows lifted slowly from the lake. She played the piece all the way through. She closed the cover of the keyboard. She rose from the bench. She turned to the 3 of them and said simply, "Thank you. Let us go to work." Anders went to work. He filed the codicil and Marguerite's bequest letter at the Orange County Surrogate's Court the following morning at 9:30. He filed the binder of forged will documentation with the New York State Bar Association by overnight courier the same afternoon, and he hand-delivered a sealed copy to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office on Wednesday morning. The Tuxedo Park trustees, who had heard rumors of Roland's behavior for years and never acted, met in emergency session on Wednesday evening and voted unanimously to recognize Coralee Voorhees as the legal owner and resident of the Wexler Voorhees mansion on Tower Hill Road, effective immediately. The mansion title was recorded in Cora's name within 4 business days. The forged will documentation moved through the New York State Bar Association's disciplinary committee on a track that surprised even Anders. The probate clerk in Goshen was suspended within 72 hours and indicted by the Orange County grand jury within 10 days. Roland Voorhees was suspended from his investment licenses pending review by the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority within 2 weeks. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened an inquiry into Roland's conduct over the past decade after a confidential referral from the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that included the list of 7 other elderly clients in Linus's handwriting. 2 of those 7 estates filed restitution claims against Roland's firm within 30 days, totaling $3.8 million. 3 more were under active investigation by the end of the calendar year. Petra Voorhees filed for divorce within 9 days of the suspension. She had been waiting, Cora understood, from a remark Anders made over tea, for any pretext that would allow her to extract herself with her own assets intact, and Roland's professional disgrace was the pretext she had been waiting for since approximately 2014. Roland's Manhattan apartment, an East Side condominium he had purchased with leverage in 2003, was sold within 4 months to satisfy a creditor's lien filed by his own firm. He moved to a small 1-bedroom condominium in Yonkers near the Hudson, where he was seen most mornings at a small diner with a newspaper and a cup of black coffee, his navy 3-piece suits replaced by a gray cardigan and slacks, his gold cufflinks and heavy gold wristwatch quietly sold to an estate jeweler on Lexington Avenue. The Tuxedo Park trustees sent Cora a formal letter of welcome, signed by all 7 of them, on heavy cream stationery. The letter noted, in a single graceful sentence at its close, that her father had been one of the most respected friends this park has ever known, and his daughter is welcomed into the place he made for her, with the gratitude of every household whose Steinway he ever set right. Cora placed it in the small mahogany writing box in the music room where Marguerite had kept her own correspondence. The Tuxedo Park Bulletin ran a short, dignified article on the reopening of the Wexler Voorhees mansion under the headline, "Tower Hill Road welcomes a new custodian." The article quoted Wendell on Marguerite's 40-year friendship with Linus, and it noted, with the careful understatement of a community that preferred its truths spoken in lowercase, that Coralee Voorhees was the daughter the late Mr. Voorhees had spoken of with such love that the present resident of the mansion had once been moved, in his hearing, to set down a teacup and weep. On the Sunday morning following the recording of the title, Cora drove down to the small cemetery behind the Tuxedo Park Methodist Church, where Linus had been buried beside her mother 14 months earlier. She arrived at sunrise. The fog was lifting off the lake. She walked between the rows to the gray granite headstone with the single line, "Linus Voorhees," piano tuner beneath the dates. She drew from her coat pocket a single sprig of white jasmine she had cut that morning from the bush at the foot of the south porch step of the Wexler Voorhees mansion. She laid the sprig at the base of the headstone. She did not speak. She placed her hand on the cold granite for a long minute. The fog lifted. The light came through the bare branches of the oaks. She walked back to the car. She drove home. She moved into the Wexler Voorhees mansion on the first weekend of November. She brought the worn medium brown leather suitcase with the brass clasps and a small box of music from the cottage on Fox Hill Road and the chipped porcelain teacup her father had drunk from for 60 years. She did not bring much else. The mansion was already full of what she needed. She drew the white linen sheets off the chairs and the settees and the mahogany side tables one by one over the course of the first week, folding them carefully and storing them in the linen closet on the second floor in the way Marguerite had folded them herself. She uncovered the leaded windows. The morning light came in from the east through the music room glass, and the evening light came in from the west through the parlor glass. And the house began, very slowly, to breathe again. Anders arranged the loan of the Beethoven and Chopin manuscripts to the Morgan Library and Museum in Manhattan. The manuscripts traveled in a climate-controlled case under the supervision of 2 armed couriers and 1 extremely happy curator. They were placed on permanent loan, with Cora retaining ownership and full access. The Morgan opened a small dedicated room for them on the second floor with a placard that read, "On loan from the Linus Voorhees and Marguerite Wexler collection, Tuxedo Park, New York." The Sargent portrait of Marguerite stayed in the parlor for 1 month, and then, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Cora and Wendell carried it together into the music room and rehung it on the long north wall above the Steinway. Marguerite had written, in a postscript to her bequest letter, that she had always wished the portrait to hang in the music room. Cora had read the postscript on the second night after the title was recorded, and she had not been able to look at the parlor wall the same way afterward. The portrait now hung above the keyboard. The young dark-haired woman with the high collar and the single string of pearls looking out across the room toward the fieldstone fireplace. The Steinway looked smaller beneath it. The room looked, finally, the way Marguerite had wanted it to look. The Steinway itself was restored over the course of 3 weeks by Gunnar Olsen, an old colleague of Linus's who had apprenticed beside him in the 1960s. Gunnar arrived with a leather case of tools that Cora recognized at once as the twin of her father's. He replaced 2 hammers, regulated the action, and restrung the upper register. On the last afternoon, he tuned the instrument from the lowest A to the highest C and played, very softly, the opening 8 bars of the Schubert Intermezzo in a flat, and Cora, listening from the doorway, understood that her father had taught Gunnar that piece in 1968 and that Gunnar had been waiting 58 years to play it on this instrument in this room. Cora founded the Linus Voorhees and Marguerite Wexler Music Foundation in early December. She funded it with a small portion of the Beethoven manuscript appraisal, set aside in an endowment Anders had structured to support the foundation in perpetuity, with the manuscripts themselves remaining in the Morgan and never to be sold. The foundation provided scholarships for young pianists from low-income households across the Ramapo region of New York and northern New Jersey, and paid summer residencies at the Wexler Voorhees mansion for young classical performers who needed a quiet place to prepare a recital program. 5 scholarships were awarded in the first year. The first recipient was a 13-year-old girl from Newburgh, whose mother taught 4th grade at a public elementary school. The girl had been studying piano on a borrowed upright in her grandmother's apartment for 6 years. Cora drove down to Newburgh herself on a Saturday morning to deliver the scholarship letter in person. The girl met her at the door in a hand-knitted cardigan and a pair of sneakers, and when she read the letter, she looked up at Cora with the same dark, serious eyes Cora had looked up with at her own father at 13, and Cora, standing on the small concrete stoop of an apartment building in Newburgh in the December cold, understood that she had finally found the work her father had been preparing her for since the year she was born. Anders chaired the foundation board. Wendell taught a quarterly Saturday lecture on Tuxedo Park's history in the music room of the mansion, open to all foundation scholars, with tea served afterward in the parlor under the chilled Hassam landscapes. Imogen Tenzer consulted on the manuscript curation at the Morgan and on the Foundation's annual summer concert, which was held on the wraparound veranda in late July with the wisteria in full bloom and the morning fog already a memory. The first summer concert featured the 13-year-old girl from Newburgh playing a Chopin nocturne, and Cora, sitting in the third row of folding chairs on the gravel drive in a pale gray linen dress with the cameo brooch still at her throat, listened to the chords move through the cold mountain air and out into the autumn gold forest, and thought of her father's careful hands on a tuning hammer at the kitchen table on Fox Hill Road. On Sunday afternoons through the long winter and the first slow spring and the warming summer, Cora opened the Steinway in the music room of the Wexler Voorhees mansion and played the same Schubert intermezzo in a flat she had played at midnight in the rented studio in the village on the worst night of her 69th year. The Sargent portrait of Marguerite hung above the keyboard. The morning fog lifted from Tuxedo Lake outside the south windows. The brass key on the tarnished silver chain that her father had carried for 14 years now hung on a fine gold chain around her neck, beside the cameo brooch where it warmed against her skin through the cream silk blouse and the long midnight blue wool coat. She played the piece slowly, the way her father had taught her, and at the end of every Sunday afternoon, she rose from the bench and walked to the south window and looked out across the wisteria and the jasmine and the autumn gold forest, and she thought every time of what her father had written on the cream sheet of paper in the fireproof safe behind the wainscoting. Walk out into the morning fog with your suitcase and write the rest of your life. She did, she had, she was. Thank you for climbing every step of Coralee's journey, from a folded dollar bill across a polished Manhattan oak table to the morning fog lifting off Tuxedo Lake outside a music room her father had been keeping for her since the year she was born. If Coralee's story touched something deep inside you, if you've ever been handed a single dollar bill by your own brother and told it was the entirety of your inheritance, if you've ever wondered whether the people who came before you were quietly preparing a life for you, if you've discovered that the loved one you lost had been listening more carefully than the one who was loud, leave just one word in the comments describing the exact moment you realized that the quiet ones in your life had heard you all along. Because Coralee's story proves that piano tuners hear what bankers never bother to listen for, that a friendship of 40 years between an old woman and a quiet man can outweigh every investment portfolio Wall Street has ever built, and that a brass key on a tarnished silver chain can outvalue a folded dollar bill in any conference room in Manhattan. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that what looks like a folded dollar bill across a polished oak table can hide an inheritance no investment banker ever counted, because the piano tuner kept the right key on a tarnished silver chain for decades. Welcome to the last chapter. We'll see you in the next story.